Looking deep into this greenery, are you able to spot one of our old native predators sat watching you? In the county of Hampshire sits an almost 600 square kilometres national park, the New Forest, the largest area of unsown vegetation in lowland Britain, hosting a variety of rare native species. Within the New Forest National Park is the New Forest Wildlife Park, a 0.1 kilometre squared attraction that holds a variety of species native or recently native to the UK. Join me in this video as I walk the park and introduce you to the species you can see if you ever visit here. As you walk up to the park entrance, you'll notice the restaurant, which I didn't enter but is open to the public whether or not you visit the actual park. Given that there are over 10,000 species of wild mushroom in the UK, it's great to see adverts near the entrance that the park has activities focusing on our less popular species too. A helpful list of prices was placed on the fence next to the entrance, although I had already looked these up online in advance. The first stop of the park was a row of owl enclosures. One thing that I loved about the park was that every enclosure had a variety of information about the species and also let you know a little bit of information about the individuals at the park. Twill is a northern long-eared owl that was hatched in 2013. This species is identified by the long head feathers, which are known as ear tufts but aren't actually ears. They have a spotty distribution across the whole of the UK, with migratory individuals joining our year-round residents for the winter. Next to Twill was another native owl, the barn owl. I'll include these signs in the video so you can pause to read more about each species if you'd like to. This barn owl's name is Hobbit, and she belongs to the most widely distributed species of owl in the world, although they're sadly declining in the UK over the last century because of the use of pesticides. Next to the barn owl was the little owl. Little owls were introduced to the UK in the late 1800s. They perch on fence posts to survey the area for prey, then glide down to the ground to pursue it on foot. One thing I noted throughout my visit was how impressive the enclosure sizes were for each species. Our next stop in the park is called the Glass House. As you round the corner from the owls, the next species you'll spot are the giant otters in their outdoor enclosure. This enclosure belongs to Panambi and her daughter Mimu. Although this species isn't native to the UK, they can provide a great conversation starter to discuss otters and their diversity. Much like our own native otters, the giant otters were almost wiped out in their South American range. They're still endangered, and captive populations like the ones at the New Forest Wildlife Park are an important refuge for the species. They allow them to continue to exist while conservationists tackle the ongoing threats in their natural habitat. In fact, in another section of the park, there is a male giant otter called Simuni, who was a member of the first litter of giant otters to ever be born in the UK. As a species that is exclusively awake during the day, it was really great to get to watch this pair displaying a range of natural behaviours. I've worked somewhere that housed giant otters in the past and loved taking the time to watch them, so it was great to see this species again. Its sleek brown fur is shorter than in any other otter species and so dense that water can't actually pass through it, which ensures that their skin beneath it is always dry. The patch of creamy white fur under their chin is as unique to giant otters as our fingerprints are to us, which makes it easy to identify individuals. Giant otters stand up to deliberately display this patch, which is a behaviour called periscoping, and it helps them recognise each other. It was really great to see natural foraging behaviour being encouraged in these females, with them catching fish from their outdoor pond and taking it to land to eat. They grasp the fish in their front paws and start by eating the head. This species can consume 10% of its weight in fish each day. When this predator emerges from the water, you can certainly see how well adapted they are, running on webbed feet with a huge paddle-like tail held out behind them. As with the owls, it was great to see just how much room these otters had, although at the time of my visit it was less than usual. Storm Eunice happened 2 days before my visit, and this park didn't escape its effects. The roof panels above the otters' indoor pool had been torn off by the storm. All captive animal species are given a classification of how dangerous they are, with 1 being the highest and 3 being the lowest. Giant otters are a Category 1 species, so allowing them into an area of the enclosure with a hole in the roof would cause too much of an escape risk, so I wasn't able to watch them swimming in their larger indoor pool during my visit. Opposite the giant otter's indoor area was the common toad, a native species that I imagine many watching will have seen in their gardens. The sun's reflection and the toad's own ability to camouflage meant that I couldn't actually see this one, but it's great to know that the park's representing amphibians too. Next to the toad was another native species, this time our native otter. The park provided a really lovely indoor area for the Eurasian otters and a spacious outdoor area that I didn't film. Unlike giant otters, our native species are nocturnal and so won't be awake during the day. However, the park does have a small window that you can use to peek into their daytime den, or holt. Franklin's parents were rescued from the wild and had him in captivity. Like with giant otters, captive breeding has helped preserve the genetic diversity in this species. Released captive animals over the last few decades have helped the once almost extinct population to recover. As he wakes up for a scratch, take a look at those large eyes, ears, nose, and whiskers, which are all tools otters use to help them detect their underwater prey. A little down from the otters are the harvest mice. At the time I visited, the park had around 90 harvest mice in this enclosure. This native rodent is on the decline in the UK, so the New Forest Wildlife Park works to breed them and then releases around 40 juveniles every few months as part of a wider conservation programme. This enclosure really highlights the importance of being patient and waiting for animals to come out when you visit wildlife parks. I came back later in the day and there was barely a harvest mouse to be seen, despite them all still being in there. During my first look at the enclosure, they were covering the entire thing, having scurried out of their hidden nests in the search of seeds. As the UK's smallest rodent, they can be easy to overlook, but they play an important role in our ecosystem. They not only eat a variety of seeds, but also ensure that invertebrate populations don't get too high by predating on them. They also make up important parts of the diets of other native species, like the owls that we saw earlier. A unique characteristic of this species is that they're the only UK mammal with a prehensile tail, meaning they can grip onto objects with it. You can often spot them above the ground, like this one among the branches, holding on with its tail as it searches for food. Next to the harvest mice is the Asian short-clawed otter enclosure. I love that the park has representation for otters across the globe, with South America, European, and now Asian species on show. This exhibit houses a breeding pair and their offspring. This species is declining in its native range and is actually the smallest otter species in the world. Right next door is another mustelid, the ferret. This species originates from our native polecats and was domesticated over 2,000 years ago. This enclosure was also hit by the storm, but as a domesticated species, the ferrets are able to continue living here while it's repaired. The 4 ferrets at the park were handed over as rescue pets by the RSPCA. Like many domestic species, ferrets come in a range of fur colours that you don't naturally see in the wild. When I worked as a keeper, ferrets were one of the species I looked after, and I fell in love with them. They're extremely playful animals who require a lot of enrichment to stay entertained, but sometimes their playful nips can be a little too hard and remind you of the predator they're descended from. Unfortunately, the polecats had to be moved from their main enclosure due to the storm damage. As the wilder counterpart, they would be much more capable of escaping through the roof of their enclosure than the ferrets. Luckily, there are backups in place, and so I was able to see the polecats a little further along this section in an area called the Night Watch Barn. As they're a nocturnal species, it wasn't surprising to see that these small predators were sleeping the day away in their temporary housing. Luckily, when I returned later in the day, I was able to see one up and about. This species was hunted almost to extinction in the UK, but breeding programs like the one at the New Forest Wildlife Park have been helping bring them back. You can tell this polecat is a wild descendant rather than a ferret with similar fur colours, thanks to a few marking features. The dark fur on its face extends down to its nose, it doesn't have a pale throat patch, its paws are completely dark, and there aren't any white guard hairs across its body. The night barn houses more than just these polecats. Looking around, you can see a variety of enclosures for some of the shyer and nocturnal species, as well as a load of information about these species. A pair of rescued wild badgers, Ira and Daisy, can be seen here. These are our largest native mustelids, and actually our largest native carnivore that still has wild populations living here. They have a cozy set provided to mimic their natural burrowing behaviour, but I couldn't see the pair because they were actually in their outdoor set, which they built for themselves. On the other side of the night barn is the European tree frog enclosure. One of my frequent viewers actually sent me a comment about tree frogs in the New Forest a little while ago, which helped inspire my trip to this park. There is a debate about whether or not this species is deserving of native status. A few populations exist in the UK, and all but one were deliberately introduced. That one is actually a population in the New Forest National Park, which has no clear record for its origins. Could it be a survivor from the suspected tree frog populations in the UK hundreds of years ago, or an unrecorded release? Either way, the species doesn't currently have legal protections here. Have you been able to notice any of the tree frogs as I've been panning over the enclosure? Look closely in the top corner of the tank and you'll see one. This is a great demonstration that you sometimes need to look for a lot longer than a few seconds to get the most out of animal parks and be able to see all of the species. The final species in the night barn was the red fox, another native carnivore and the largest of all fox species. I liked this enclosure the most, with the indoor section modelled after a stable. The outdoor section reminded me of an overgrown garden, which is a habitat foxes frequently occupy in the UK. As a largely nocturnal species, this pair will likely holed up in a den under one of these structures. Even though I didn't see the foxes, there was still plenty to learn about them on the signs around the park. After exiting the glass house, you can round the corner to a new area containing more native species. First up is the grey partridge. The grey partridge is a ground-dwelling bird that was once common throughout the UK but has undergone serious declines. It has a distinctive red face, grey body and chestnut-coloured horseshoe shape on its chest. The grey partridges bred at the New Forest Wildlife Park are released to help boost the wild population. As you walk past the grey partridge, you'll notice signs describing the life cycle of native invertebrates. Next door to the partridge is the Burrowing Owl enclosure, housing brother wayside and sister rival. These American owls are part of the same family as our native little owls, which we met earlier. Like grey partridges, they're a ground-dwelling species and raise their young in burrows that other species have abandoned. Unlike other owls, this species is active during the day, although like other owls, they mostly hunt at night. Like our little owls, this species will sit on a perch to look for prey, then swoop down to the ground and chase after it on foot. Sitting on the bench next to the burrowing owls, you can look out not only over the outdoor otter enclosures, but also a patch set aside for our wild birds. Bird feeders hanging from the trees are used by blue tits and great tits, while nearby a hive of busy bees is working hard to pollinate the few early spring flowers. A robin was brave enough to check out what I was doing, but the other birds kept themselves to the bushes, not daring to eat from the feeder until I had moved on. Just down the path from the bird feeders is a looping path around a pond. Decorating the fence around the path were a series of signs taking you through the life cycle of our native frogs, detailing their different life stages through the year as they hatch from their frog-spawn eggs into water-bound tadpoles, then undergo metamorphosis into froglets before growing up into adult frogs. I can imagine this pond full of natural vegetation will be teeming with life in a few months' time, although right now the frogs are probably tucked away at the bottom of the pond, fast asleep for the winter months. They can stay underwater for prolonged periods of time, their skin well adapted to taking in oxygen without needing to use the lungs that they breathe with on land. Just beyond the pond was a larger body of water where I could see various features that would help our native wildlife. Bird boxes up on the trees would be greatly appreciated by birds preparing for the breeding season, and the corrugated iron makes a great warm shelter for amphibians and reptiles. I've linked my wildlife gardening guide in the video description if you want to understand more about garden features that can help local wildlife. As you leave the frog pond section, you'll see signs discussing the conservation projects that the New Forest Wildlife Park is involved in. Of course, having all these animals in the wild would be an ideal situation, but parks like this are a great refuge when being in the wild is too much of a threat. You're welcome to pause the video to read about their work with our native Eurasian otter, harvest mouse, European polecat, water vole, pine marten and Scottish wildcat. As we leave this section of the park, the next species we pass is the snowy owl. The pair here are unrelated ex-pets that were handed over to the park. They are the only owl species with largely white plumage, and males like Orkney tend to be much more white than the females. They aren't native to the UK, having a range further north and primarily breeding on the tundra. Their feather-covered feet and beak help them keep warm in the Arctic conditions. Female snowy owls like Hurdy are larger and more heavily marked than males, helping them camouflage as they lay their eggs. The next area of the park is the deer section. As you approach this section, you pass a large play and picnic area, perfect for families on a day out. All of the next set of animals are found through this double gate, a system designed to make sure the Roe Deer, Sika Deer and 10 fallow deer that are free roaming in the area don't escape. Although native to Eastern Asia, Sika deer have been introduced to the UK. The park's one Sika deer came here after a traffic accident. The rescued fallow deer herd come here from a few locations. Unlike Sika deer, which were introduced in the 1800s, fallow deer were introduced to the UK in the 11th century. They're so common and widespread that they are considered naturalised, meaning they have well-established wild populations. One of our two native deer species, the Roe Deer, can be seen in this area. She was brought to the park after members of the public brought her to the vets, having found her when she was very young. Although I don't know the circumstances behind this, it's fairly common for deer to leave their offspring alone for long stretches of time. This keeps them hidden from predators while the mother watches from a safe distance. If you see a young deer that's been left alone, so long as it's not visibly in distress or injured, the best course of action is usually to leave it alone, for its mother will return when you've left the area. Our second native deer species is the red deer, but this herd of our largest land mammal weren't on show when I visited. Within this area there is another otter species, the smooth-coated otter. Another Asian native otter, this species is known for living in the largest family groups of any otters. Smooth-coated otter families can number up to 25 individuals, although within this park there are only 4, 2 parents, Song and Soraya, and their cubs, Anupa and Ananda. It is closely related to the Asian short-clawed otter that we saw earlier, and in Singapore there are actually wild hybrids between the two species. I spent some time watching these otters playing in the water, wrestling in a way that occasionally looked quite violent but didn't cross past play. These sorts of behaviours are important for group-living mammals. It helps keep muscles honed in case individuals get attacked, teaches them techniques needed to hunt prey, helps individuals work out the hierarchy of the group, teaches them behaviours needed during parenthood, and often is done just for the sake of fun. One animal I was particularly excited to see was Hamish the pine marten. I've never seen this rare native animal before, so it was great to catch sight of him. Once our second most common carnivore, these animals now exist in a few isolated populations. Hamish is part of a breeding pair, and some of their young have already been released back into the wild. Very few places keep pine martens in the UK because they're so difficult to breed in captivity, which means that the work done by the New Forest Wildlife Park is really important. Much like with the giant otters, you can tell pine martens apart by the shape of their creamy throat markings. The next species that should have been in this area was the Scottish wildcat. Unfortunately, as you can see in this clip, the storm brought down a large tree straight on top of their enclosure. The cats were unharmed, but with less than 50 individuals left in the wild, this breeding program that these cats are part of is highly valuable. If you want to contribute to helping the New Forest Wildlife Park rebuild their Scottish wildcat enclosure and continue to save this species, then I've left a link to their adoption packs below. A little way down the path are the Eurasian Eagle Owls Brock and Ash, who are both rescued ex-pets. A once native species that became extinct in the UK for several centuries, these owls now live and breed here in the wild once again. It is one of the world's largest owls, and although it doesn't officially have the native classification here, it does have legal protection. Next door are the Ural Owl pair, Dawn and Twilight, who have successfully had a female chick since being matched. This species isn't native to the UK, instead being found widely across Northern Europe and Asia. But back to our native species, we can see the Tawny Owl. These 3 owls show just how well camouflage works in the habitat that an animal evolved into. Can you see the 3 tawny owl faces peeking out from this vegetation? Perhaps this view from a little later in the day can help you spot them. As our most common owl species, it's likely you've walked past tawny owls roosting and not even realised it. Maybe even one of these 3 before their health issues meant they had to be rescued. The final species in this section of the park is the European bison. Can you spot them sleeping in the far corner of their paddock? Maybe this view from later on in the day is better. This herd is made up of 2 males, a female, and a calf that was born mid-2020. This species was hunted to extinction in Europe by the early 1900s, but has successfully been reintroduced after captive breeding programs. There are currently plans to follow this trend by reintroducing bison to the UK this year, with the aim of helping woodland management. After exiting the deer area, there is a short walk through a wild patch of woods to get to the final section of the park. The Wallaby Wood houses much more than just wallabies. Another double gate system lets you enter the winding paths of the Wallaby Wood. As you walk along, you'll spot beautiful art, giving you hints about what's coming up. The New Forest Wildlife Park has a group of red-necked wallabies. As you walk around, you'll likely catch a glimpse of them free roaming the area. Individuals escaped from private collections and have now established populations in the UK, meaning that we now have wild marsupials here, despite them being extremely distantly related to all of our native mammals. A breeding herd of Mouflon also live within the Wallaby Woods. The New Forest Wildlife Park is the only collection in the UK to hold Mouflon. This wild species is thought to be the ancestor of all domestic sheep species and is native to Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan and Iran. Near the Mouflon herd is a group of wild boar. This ancestor to domestic pigs went extinct in the UK in the 1600s, but was reintroduced for meat farming. Around 30 years ago, escaped individuals established themselves in the wild, so they're now found in a few spots in Britain. They uproot vegetation in search of food, which is why these boars are rooting through such muddy ground. This species is large and potentially can come into conflict with people who are threatened by their size. They usually grow to around 90 kilograms, but have been reported up to 200 kilograms. Conflicts can also arise due to the impacts this species has on the land. They are ecosystem engineers, meaning they physically modify habitats. This can have positive and negative impacts, depending on where they are. But the role of an ecosystem engineer is just one important part of a healthy ecosystem overall. Now we come on to one of the most exciting species in the park. This enclosure houses a pair of Eurasian Lynx sisters. I made a video all about lynx recently, which covers how this species may have been breeding in the UK only a few hundred years ago, and the positives and negatives about their potential reintroduction. One big takeaway from that video is that if lynx were reintroduced, you would likely never even realise it. These forest dwellers are masters of camouflage and have a nickname of being ghosts of the forest. In fact, there have been 2 lynx on screen throughout this whole clip. Replay it if you didn't catch them the first time. Luckily, I was there at feeding time, watching the centre of the screen as one of the lynx comes forward and sits, waiting to be fed. This is Tora, the more confident of the pair, with her sister Inga behaving much more like a wild lynx and keeping completely out of sight while people are around. I sat around for half an hour after the initial food was thrown in, but it was worth it for the following glimpses that I got. Watch as this beautiful cat creeps in closer, first to take a sniff of the scent enrichment that had been thrown into the enclosure, before finally taking a piece of meat. Despite being the largest lynx species, these animals are only the size of a small Labrador, but don't underestimate it. Look at those large paws and muscled legs, perfect for helping it ambush its favoured food, the Roe Deer that we saw earlier. A little time later out came Inga, still hanging back but now with both lynx clearly visible. Notice how she has a much greyer pelt than her sister. Lynx fur colour can vary with the seasons, and with how unpredictable the weather is becoming, seasonal fur sometimes changes at the wrong time. Here comes Tora again, confidence growing more the less people are stood around to watch. At this point, only myself and one other person from the crowd had chosen to stay. Watch as she comes right up to take the food from the fence, around a metre away from me. The next species in this video is the grey wolf. This pack of 5 siblings was born in 2010 and kept out of the breeding programme. Captive animals in reputable collections are part of the stud book, which keeps track of the genetic diversity across the whole captive population. These wolves are part of a genetic line that is well represented in captivity, so there was no need for them to have their own offspring. Like the lynx, grey wolves were once native carnivores to the UK. However, they come into conflict with people a lot more easily than lynx, given their much larger size and social structures. This means that since their extinction here in the late 1600s, there has been great pushback against the idea of reintroducing them. They're still a fascinating animal to observe though. Watch as the 2 darker males, Rocky and Chaser, interact with their sisters, Aspen, Cedar and Idaho. Pack structure is much more complex than the classic assumption of alpha pairs, and each wolf has an individual relationship with every other wolf in the pack. Can you tell who the least dominant individual of this pack is? Look out for her low crouching posture and tail tucked between her legs. Classic canine body language meant to appease the more dominant individuals. Go back through this clip and watch the wagging tails at different levels of elevation as the rest of the siblings greet each other, and in particular look at which individuals are submissively licking at the mouths of others from below. Look closely at the different fur colours and markings. Although wolves have much less diversity in appearance than their domestic dog counterparts, their fur patterns are still unique enough to help us tell individuals apart. A little later on, as the wolves prepare to be fed, they start to move around their spacious enclosure. Watch this one as it waits on the mound of the underground den that the pack dug for themselves. The pack's pacing might be reminiscent of your pet dog when they know feeding time is approaching. They're all on high alert, waiting for a keeper to appear with their meat. As the first of the food gets thrown in, it's the most submissive wolf who gets the first portion. Her ranking in the pack means that she's the one that gets sent out first to investigate anything new, with the more dominant wolves hanging back until their safety is ensured. In a captive setting like this one, it means that she lucks out and ends up getting fed first. The rest of the pack are quick to follow, each taking their own portions without any squabbling. This pack have lived together for 11 years and understand that there will be enough to go around. In the wild, wolves would work together to take down a large prey animal rather than eating a prepared set of cuts of meat. The New Forest Wildlife Park can mimic this behaviour occasionally. Due to the nature of the national park, sometimes wild deer are killed on the roads. These carcasses are occasionally donated to the wildlife park, and both the wolves and lynx are able to eat some of what their natural prey would be. Watch as the wolves that have finished eating start to scent mark by raising their legs. This is a way of marking their territory, clearly saying to other packs that might be drawn in by the scent of fresh prey that this patch belongs to this pack and outsiders should stay away. Finally, we come out of the Wallaby Woods and head back to the park entrance. But on the way, there's one last stop to make. Hedgehogs are one of our native species, and at this time of year they will be tucked away in shelters like this one of only 3 mammals in the UK that experience hibernation. And that concludes our tour of the New Forest Wildlife Park. Have you ever visited the park, or do you plan to in the future? Subscribe to Ferret Forest to keep learning about UK nature.